Deuteronomy 1, 19 through 25, 37 through 40. Then as the Lord our God commanded us, we set out from Moab and went toward the hill country of the Amorites through all that vast and dreadful wilderness that you have seen. And so we reached Kadesh Barnea. Then I said to you, you've reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord your God has given us. See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up and take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Then all of you came to me and said, let us send men ahead and spy out the land for us and bring back a report about the route we are about to take and the towns we will come to. The idea seemed good to me. So I selected 12 of you, one man from each tribe. They left and they went up into the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and explored it. Taking with them some of the fruit of the land, they brought it down to us and reported, it is a good land that the Lord our God has given us. Because of you, the Lord became angry with me also and said, you shall not enter it either, but your assistant Joshua son of Nun will inherit it. Encourage him because he will lead Israel to inherit it. And the little ones that you said will be taken captive, your children who do not yet know good from bad, they will enter the land. I will give it to them, and they will take possession of it. But as for you, turn around and set out toward the desert along the route to the sea. Red Sea.
Good morning. I'm going to put this by the pancakes here. Make some room up here. Tom, aren't you glad you got off the hook today?
Yeah, there's some good ones in there.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. If you'll take your bulletins inside of the sermon notes, we're beginning our series here on issues in our lives. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 1. And so let's just trust that the Lord has something to say to us about the fears in our lives. It was after the door of her apartment was closed in 1949. This lady went out 3 times in 30 years. She went out once to give ice cream to a friend of hers who was failing in health. She went out a second time for an operation, and then she went out to a third time for a funeral. But beside that, she stayed in her home starting at the age of 31 and did not come out until she was 61. She imprisoned herself for over 30 years inside her house. She just never came out. She was suffering from what they call agoraphobia, which is fear of open spaces. And she locked herself in her home and just stayed there 31 years. Just stayed there. Don't want to see anyone. Watched as the stomach turns, the soap operas or whatever she did. And the truth of the matter is people live with all kinds of fears in their life, don't they? Some of them we don't even know. Let me ask you, how many of you have some type of fear in your life? What are you afraid of? There are spiders. Some are saying, oh, that's it. What's that, arachnophobia? Is that right? There's a movie called that. What's it called, Tom? Okay, you got it. Heights, elevators, the list goes on what we are afraid of, but then we want to talk about the spirit of fear today, the spirit of fear that can take over someone's life. And that's what we're talking about today, a fear that can come and dominate our life. It causes us where we can't even move. Not that it's all bad, because God has created fear so that we could have a sudden burst of energy and strength when things happen, when emergencies take place. So that's good because it motivates us to move and do something. But when fear totally takes over, it can entrap your spirit and it can terrorize your heart. And you just can't move. I don't want to see anyone. As a pastor, I've been in rooms where families have gotten tragic news and seen fear in their eyes and fear in their lives. I've seen and have tried to help spouses who were told by their partner that they're getting a divorce. Fear just set in. I've enrolled my kids in a new school and watched if they would be accepted. Fear. Some of you have received bad news from the doctor. All of a sudden fear comes in. It's like you think you're okay, but really you're not okay. Someone said we all, like the little kid in a play, he has 2 lines he has to memorize, and he comes out, and the child's supposed to say when he walks out on stage, "It is I, be not afraid." But when he sees the crowd, he walks out solo by himself, and he says, "It is me, and I'm scared." Someone has defined fear as a small trickle of doubt that runs through your mind, that eventually runs through a great channel that all of your thoughts drain into. And that causes fear. In the Bible, there are many stories dominated by this theme of fear. It's there. For example, the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, when the storm hit, they were afraid. In the story of David and Goliath, there's fear that was present. Even Saul was afraid of Goliath. David was the only one who would go after him. But in the Old Testament story today, that Ron read for us, there's a great illustration here. When the Israelites left Kadesh Barnea and went into the land of Canaan to spy out the land. And it's in 2 books, Numbers 13 and 14, but we're looking at Deuteronomy, the short version, chapter 1, verses 19 and following. And I'd like to take this story and glean from it principles concerning the topic of fear in our lives. In this text, Israel had just came across the desert and was now ready to go into the land of Canaan, and this is a land promised to them by God, and it was a land that flowed with milk and honey. It was the promised land, and now they're on the threshold of entering Canaan. They're right there. And God allowed them to send some spies into the land, to spy out the land, to check it out. So they sent 12 spies that went into the land. And as we review the story, we see principles before us. And very clearly we see principles before us concerning fear in our lives. And what we will find is that the principle that dominates us, when fear dominates us, is the same principles taken from this story of Deuteronomy chapter 1. The first principle we want to learn is, number 1, is fear disregards God's plan. Fear disregards God's plan. Look at verses 19 to 21. God said, "Now possess the land. Do not fear. Do not be discouraged." Here was their warrant for possessing the land. They were told to go ahead. Here was their invitation to go take the land, but they would not go because of fear. They would not move because of fear. Fear gripped their lives, so much so that they just stood there paralyzed. They didn't take the land. And I'm telling you this morning, if you let fear dominate your life, it will keep you from experiencing God's plan for your life. And we need to realize why will it keep us? Well, we need to first of all realize, because if you belong to Jesus Christ, and He is in your life and He is your Lord, we need to realize, like Timothy, that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of life, and a sound mind. God has not created us to be creatures dominated by fear, as we take His word. He has given us principle, the principle of faith. Faith is a decision-making process based upon the Word of God with regards to the emotional questioning of that Word. So God tells us not to be fearful. And we need to realize that. And if we are determined to live in fear, we are disregarding God's plan for our lives, which is not to have fear. In Romans 8:15, Paul said, "For you did not receive a spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption," which is when we cry out, "Abba, Father." An intimate relationship with God. God's plan and desire for us is to live above fear in our lives. What are you afraid of? What am I afraid of? What are our issues there? Which leads us to the second principle. Fear distorts God's purposes. Fear distorts God's purposes. It's interesting what happens to us when we begin to allow fear to dominate our lives. Everything gets out of perspective, doesn't it? Everything gets distorted. Everything goes into whack. It's illustrated here in the story. The 10 men went into Canaan and they saw, and they just said, "We can't go there. There's giants in the land." And there's fear in this situation, and the story started getting bigger. They're already mad because they were taken out of Egypt and moved across to heading towards Canaan. They're already angry, and now they have another excuse. They ran into 2, maybe 1 giant. Whatever it was, whatever kind of people these were, and they just blew the story up. And what's interesting is when there's fear in our life, 1 giant can turn into a whole population of giants. The story gets bigger. Fear causes people to become irrational. Fear causes people to distort life where they can't see it the way it is. We look for any excuse. Now, if you will determine that you will let fear take over your life, you can be sure you're going to have distorted pictures of life. You won't see clearly, which leads us to the third point. Fear discourages God's people. Fear will take everything in your life and destroy it. It will distract it. It will discourage everyone you come into contact with. Fear is not just an isolated thing in our life. Fear affects everyone around you. Get this, 10 men of the 12 came back with an evil report. And those 10 men were so determined to just not move ahead. We're not going to move. And as a result, they caused the 40-year wandering of the Israelites there. Caused all kinds. They affected everyone around them. Fear is infectious. Fear is infectious. It's not about you and yourself and you. It's about you discouraging God's people. Fear touches everything you touch, which leads us to the fourth point. For fear disbelieves God's promises. Fear disbelieves God's promises. The challenge before the Israelites wasn't something that came out of nowhere, but God had been with them all along. All across the desert and their journey across the desert to the promised land. Yet, learning always involves testing. We're always tested. And the test would be, are they going to trust God to get them into the promised land no matter what they saw or what they felt or what they did? They had all of God's provision, but would they trust? It would seem to me that even the defining moment of anyone's faith is to trust Him in those difficult moments because God said so and He would be with them. And to build upon their past. God had already moved in their past. He should give them encouragement for the future. God is working today, and we need to look at the fact that He just moved yesterday. Why are we doubting today? Why are we in fear today? And then in the future. And we need to continue to look at that. The seeming bad experience of the 10 spies in the text here had blocked out God, what God had done in the past, what He's doing today, and they couldn't even see what God's going to do in the future. It distorted the whole picture, which leads us to the fifth point. Fear disobeys God's principles. Fear disobeys God's principle. Fear is disobedience, plain and simple. If God has already said it in His Word, and we're trusting in His Word, He's already proved it in our experience in the past, will He not do it again? He says, for I am with you. All the way through the Bible, He says, fear not. Fear not, for I am with you. I'm with you to the end. Some of you are saying, I can't help it. I get into the situation, I don't like spiders. And fear enters in. And the idea is God says, I'm with you. I can't help it, yet you have to have forgotten that God has already proved Himself to you. He's already said that, and He says now we need to deal with the fear in our lives. It's called the principle of faith. Trusting God in His Word despite the emotions around it. And when all was said and done, a price of 40 years of wandering was paid for by the 10 and the rest of the people. 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, were permitted in the text to enter the promised land. Why? Because they trusted God. We need to realize this, and we need to know that God longs for you and me to simply accept the gifts from His hands. Yet fear cuts us off from accepting these gifts, doesn't it? Fear cuts us off from receiving all that God has for us. Fear settles in and we miss it. They want to accept the call, but fear holds them back. What if I'm making a wrong decision? Fear takes over and we just sit still. We retreat. What if this isn't the right partner for me? I'm not sure. Is it right? And fear settles in and we don't make the right decision. What if my business venture fails and I've already stepped out and fear steps in? What if? What if? What if? And we're not holding to the simple assurance of God's trustworthiness and His trusting nature. We're not trusting Him, and fear takes over, and this failure to trust leads us right to the doorsteps of heartbreak in our lives. And many of us have had heartbreaks and hurts and all kinds of things happen in our lives simply because fear took over our lives and we went the way of fear. Isn't that the kind of disappointing that when we go the way of fear, and yet God promises us so much more in our lives? And so there are some principles we need to apply in getting above the fear in our lives. Number one is we need to confront fear honestly in our lives. That's the principle there. We need to understand the root cause of our fear. What is it there? Sometimes there's things that are deep down in our lives. We talked about the jar in our lives of hurts from the past that we just never dealt with. We talk about the different things, and once that button's pushed, we explode. We get irrational. Fear takes over our lives. Like Jonah, you can run away, but you can't hide. Better take a stand and face the truth of why are you afraid? Why am I afraid? There's an interesting story I read here a couple of weeks ago about a Canadian couple that saw that it was the end of the world, and so therefore they want to escape the mess in society and escape everything, and so they sold everything they had and they moved to an island in 1992, a little island where it was peace and tranquility, and it was a beautiful place. They were escaping all the wars and rumors of wars, and they thought everything's falling apart. They just were tired of life and tired of everything. So they moved to the little island in 1992. The name of the island was the Falkland Islands. And so as they moved to the Falkland Islands, the Argentine military attacked because that was their territory, and the British said, no, it's a Commonwealth. And there they are in the middle of war in this little island. They were trying to escape war, and they end up in this little island, and that's where the war hit. So many of you remember reading that in the thing. And so they needed to confront their fear honestly in their life. And they ran to the war, to the middle of the war. We need to confess your fear as sin in your life. Confess it as sin. Confess it to the Lord. Fill your life with His Word. Psalm 34, write this down. I sought the Lord, and He heard me, and He delivered me from all my fear. Number 3, we need to claim God's promises of protection. This is where the Word comes forth. When you're afraid, we need to turn to the Word. Psalm 31:6, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Deuteronomy 31:6, write that down. Here's another one when you're afraid. Psalm 21:7, the Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? Here's another one. Psalm 118, verse 6, the Lord is for me. I will have no fear. What can mere people do to me? And here's the final one in Proverbs 29:25. Fearing people is a dangerous trap, but trusting the Lord means safety. So those are different texts that we have. Here's one of the things we need to do is we need to cultivate a closer relationship with Jesus Christ. There needs to be intimacy with Christ. If it's just a religious thing we're doing and we just kind of show up, we're not getting deeper with the Lord. No wonder we're afraid. We don't have an anchor in our lives. Listen, when it comes to the giants of the land, the 10 saw the giants compared to themselves. The 2 saw the giants in comparison to the size of their God. And there was a difference there. They were filled with God in their life. And we need to understand that. And love is the opposite of fear, and love dispels fear in our lives. So therefore we need to take that path. Here's another one. Commit your life to Jesus Christ. Commit yourself to Him. Fear of death dominates a lot of people, I know. People don't know where they're going to go when they die. And death happens. All ages. Overnight, we don't know. And yet people are afraid. I've asked this question in Sunday school class today, in membership class today. Have you come to the place in your spiritual life where you know for certain that if you died today, you know you would go to heaven? And you're saying, oh yeah, I'm not as bad as my neighbor, and I obey the 10 Commandments, and we go on with all this stuff. And yet it's not what the Scriptures talk about. And then I ask you a second question. Let's say you stood before God and He said, why should I let you into my heaven? What do you suppose you'd say? Well, I go to church. Oh, you're in your garage and you must be a car. It doesn't work that way. There's a relationship aspect there, transferring your trust from yourself to Christ alone for the gift of eternal life. Christ needs to be given first place in your life. And so these are the things that we can do in helping us with our situation, but there's a deeper thing when it comes to fear, because I can say all kinds of things. But sometimes we just can't flip the switch on the fears in our lives. We're afraid. There's fear in our life. I've shared this before, but there's a story of a missionary in a Jeep. He's driving his Jeep. He's a missionary in Vietnam in the 71 or 72, 1971 or 72. That's like a long time ago, isn't it? Some are saying that's not very long ago, but it's a long time ago. And he picked up the guest speaker who was going to be speaking in that country from the States, and they're going down the road, and they're just shocked at, I mean, there's a bomb going off over here, and there's bullets, sound of bullet shots being shot over here, and it's crazy, and there you can just get it there. The missionary's at peace, and he's smiling in his Jeep as he's going down the road, and the speaker's going, "You're nuts. You're a crazy person. You're missing a few screws in your life to live in this country." And so finally the speaker turned to the missionary and he asked him, this missionary still has a smile on his face, kaboom, there's a bomb going off, and they're heading down the road. And he says, "How do you have so much peace in your life through all of this? Why are you not afraid? You should be fearing for your life." And the missionary said this, and I close with this: "I have peace because I died before I came to this place." Death to self. The key to power over your fear is to die to self. Death to self. Galatians 2:20, who knows it? "For I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live it by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." When you die to self, you died to that fear, it really doesn't concern you anymore. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Let me ask you the honest question: what are you afraid of? What are you fearing? And is that fear drawing you to a deeper walk with Jesus Christ? Is it drawing you to helplessness in your life where you're saying, "God, I can't do it anymore"? That's the place to be. That's the place to die to self. That's the place to surrender that thing before Him and begin to make moves in your lives that cause you to get power over this fear in your life. What is it that's causing you, that has held you paralyzed for the last 15 years in your life? It's time to have victory today. It's time to find peace today. I die to myself that Christ might live. Father, I pray that you'd help us to understand this issue of fear in our lives. Help us, Lord, to walk with you daily, Lord, in getting victory over these little areas of our lives that paralyze us. In Jesus' name, amen.